The government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
On October 15, 1962, the CIA took aerial photographs over Cuba which showed Soviet involvement. Missile launch sites were discovered and annotated, and by the following morning, President John F. Kennedy was briefed on the fact that there were now nuclear weapons being held within striking distance of the United States. Chicago, Washington, D.C., Miami, and Los Angeles were just a few of the potential launch locations open to these missiles. Two options were presented at the confidential meeting between Kennedy and his advisors that night: a naval blockade or an airstrike with an invasion. With the risk of nuclear warfare, Kennedy chose to authorize more U-2 flights over Cuba and hold his action, thus hiding the U.S. knowledge of Soviet missiles. 2 days later, on October 18, 1962, Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko visited Kennedy to assert that Soviet involvement in Cuba was purely defensive. The next day, President Kennedy left D.C. to go on a 6-state tour beginning in Ohio and Illinois. However, on October 20th, Kennedy suddenly returned to the White House after claiming illness. After 5 grueling hours of discussion, the president and his advisors decided on a naval blockade, and a speech is drafted to be given 2 days later to address the American public. On the same day the speech is given, October 22, 1962, the president sent a letter to Nikita Khrushchev, premier of the Soviet Union, asserting, "I have not assumed that you or any other sane man would in this nuclear age deliberately plunge the world into war which it is crystal clear no country could win, and which could only result in catastrophic consequences to the whole world, including the aggressor." The next morning, the naval quarantine is officially enacted, and U.S. troops turned to surround the island nation of Cuba. Soviet submarines and ships laden with military supplies created a tension in the offshore waters, and that night President Kennedy asked Premier Khrushchev to demand his ships stay away from the U.S. ships, for fear that a small incident may spark the powder keg and create war between the two global superpowers. 2 days later, on October 24th, a reply from Chairman Khrushchev was delivered to the United States, the gist of the 3-page response consisting of the following quote: "You, Mr. President, are not declaring a quarantine, but rather are setting forth an ultimatum and threatening that if we do not give in to your demands, you will use force." Over the next few days, a reply is sent to Khrushchev, personally written by Kennedy. The majority of the Soviet ships are turned away from Cuba, and the UN began to suggest a cooling-off period, which is swiftly rejected by Kennedy, as some of the Cuban missiles are suspected to have become active. Unbeknownst to America, Fidel Castro, Prime Minister of Cuba, also begins to urge Russia to initiate a nuclear strike during this time period. Several more carefully worded letters filled with lukewarm threats and accusations are also passed. Tension is present, but on October 27th, Major Rudolph Anderson Jr., operator of an American U-2 spy plane, is shot down over Cuba, and Kennedy is urged to action. That night, Robert Kennedy is sent to secretly meet with Ambassador Anatoly Dobrin in hopes of reaching a diplomatic solution, while John F. Kennedy organized troops for an invasion. According to government records, Kennedy wanted to avoid the invasion strategy at almost any cost, as he thought it would lead to a nuclear war that would destroy more than just America. Agreement is thankfully reached. The U.S. will not invade Cuba in exchange for the removal of nuclear weapons on the island. Secretly, the U.S. also agreed to remove Jupiter missiles in Turkey that could threaten Moscow. This is the official story of the United States, but to what extent was Kennedy's insistence on a diplomatic approach beneficial to the Soviet Union? One letter, written by Nikita Khrushchev on October 26, 1962, in Soviet Russia in particular lends weight to the idea that Russia may never have been planning to actually use the nuclear missiles in the first place. Sent to express the views of the Soviets on the Cuban missiles to the United States, this letter is especially interesting because it is a first-hand account to the Cuban Missile Crisis, a primary document, and because it was written by Khrushchev, an influential Soviet whose views portrayed the goals of the Soviet political party. However, it is also important to keep in mind that this letter to JFK was written to a country in which the Soviets were in an arms race with, so it is likely censored and edited to some degree, and that, by Khrushchev's own admission inside of his letter, it does not express the views of Fidel Castro or another part of the Cuban government. To a large extent, it can be seen that the American diplomatic approach to the Cuban Missile Crisis gave leverage to the Soviet Union. As the only two superpowers remaining in the world, each was self-sufficient without the other, and embargoes had been going on before this point. Directly written into the aforementioned letter, Khrushchev points out, how could you possibly launch an offensive, even if you have an enormous number of missiles of various ranges and power on your territory using these weapons alone? It is only people, troops, who can advance. Without people, weapons, whatever their power, cannot be offensive. There were few Soviet troops in Cuba, and even if the United States were to have been bombed, without troops there was no one to invade or hold territory. With Russia an ocean away, these missiles would have been fairly pointless if launched. This lends to the idea that a diplomatic approach was actually what the Soviets both expected and wanted from the United States. A 1979 U.S. government study looked at the potential effects of a nuclear bomb hitting downtown Detroit. Detroit would have been home to a crater 1,000 feet in diameter and 200 feet deep, and around that would have been a radioactive ring. Up to 1.7 miles from ground zero there would have been nothing. Everyone within this area would have died. The survivors in the greater Detroit area and farther away would have been affected for decades to come with radiation poisoning and other defects. The blast had occurred in 1979, same as the year the study was conducted. Out of 4.3 million greater Detroit residents, 250,000 would have died, 500,000 more injured, and this is just the immediate impact number, however. And as such, the Russians essentially had the U.S. under their thumb with the diplomatic option. If the U.S. had attempted to attack Moscow with their Jupiter missiles located in Turkey, or other nuclear weapons, this explosion would have happened 5 or 6 times around the country. But the reverse was also true if Russia had attacked the United States. With Kennedy's diplomacy, the Russians were given more control of the situation in Cuba and at home, and were able to demand more than they would have been without a direct threat to the American mainland. With all-out war, the other option, many Soviet lands would have been nuked and bombed, and the financial, as well as human cost, would have been tremendous for the Soviets, especially considering how far away America is from Russia. Instead, the Russians were able to get rid of the immediate threat of the Jupiter missiles simply by sending a few ships to Cuba. By looking at the way leverage changed, as well as the financial and human cost involved in getting rid of the U.S.'s Jupiter missiles, it is plain to see that to a large extent the American diplomacy in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis was beneficial to Soviet Russia. To a lesser extent, American diplomacy was not beneficial to Russia during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The U.S. would not have remained diplomatic if Russia had launched any form of attack, and that meant that options for the Soviets were very few and very specific. And all of them were diplomatic as well. Russia could not rely on brute force or threats to get the removal of the Jupiter missiles. Instead, they had to charm their enemy and potentially be willing to compromise to some degree. The U.S. being another superpower, all-out war did not bode well for either side, and as such they had to be careful with how long they let negotiations continue, as well as what they demanded in exchange for taking their own missiles away. In addition, this diplomatic approach also made it so that the Russians needed to exchange correspondences with the U.S., and with nuclear-laced tension radiating between the two nations, there was a risk that the time it took for the conversation to be had would leave an opening for an issue to spark the previously mentioned full-blown war. Due to the time frame and limitation of options, it's clear to see that to a smaller extent, the diplomacy shown by the Americans was not beneficial to Russia.